Did you finish all the questions? You didn't finish all the questions. What are you going to do when we have the test? You won't know the answers. I think it's a good thing to work on and a good thing to continue to ponder if you don't get to them all, like when you spend some time going through it, hopefully at home. Today we have, in large part, the second missionary journey of Paul. And he goes with Barnabas at first, but then Barnabas leaves to go with Mark, and they go back to Cyprus, and then Paul and Timothy and Silas go north into the central region of Turkey. This is one of those times where the regions and a lot of the place names are unfamiliar. If you look on page 111, you'll see that I put a map. And part of it, the colors, as I've made more copies of this over time, the copy machine doesn't always pick up on it all that well. But if you actually see the colors or you look at the Google document itself, you can see a little bit more clearly where these regions are. Because it'll talk about wanting to go into Asia, and most of us don't define Asia as the western part of Turkey, but it just so happens that that's what the Romans called it, and so that's what Paul calls it. Bithynia and Pontus are in the northern part of Turkey. They are the area that borders the Black Sea. If you notice or you listen to the news now and the war in the Ukraine, a lot of it has centered around events in the Black Sea with the Russians and their fleet. That's where that is. The region of Galatia and Cappadocia and Cilicia, you can see Pamphylia and Lycia. It's a little bit harder to see, but on the far left side is an island called Achaia, where Corinth is. And Sparta, if you've heard of Sparta, the Greek cities of Sparta and Corinth. And you'll notice that some of the cities, like Paul today goes to Philippi. This is where the letter to the Philippians was written, to this church. And I think that's kind of special. We're getting into the place where some of the churches that Paul is visiting or establishing at this point are churches that he writes letters to later. Now, he doesn't write a letter to all of the ones in Pisidian Antioch and Iconium and Derbe, but I think one of his letters he mentions to send around to the other churches. The letter to the Galatians, actually that might be, those would be 3 Galatian cities, so that might be where the where his letter is sent, is to those churches. And again, Paul is on a missionary journey that's quite long. Is it a little bit hard to hear with the fan so loud? Could someone turn it down? It's just on the back of it. I think it's just a few numbers. That's a little bit better. We have to make do for this summer. It's just the way it is. As you've noticed, hopefully soon we'll have all our parts put back together, but soon might be the end of the summer. So Paul is on another missionary journey, and I think this is worth thinking about because his first missionary journey, do you remember how long it was? They went through Cyprus, and then they go up into Turkey.
3 years?
Not 3 years, that's a little bit longer. Between 18 months and 2 years. But if you think about it, how many of you, did you have a question?
Yeah, I looked up the timeline of Acts.
Yeah.
And there they indicated that that first journey was 1 year.
I think,
AD is what we're listed as.
yeah. So I think part of it is that we don't exactly know. That there's some fluidity with the dates in the book of Acts. The traditional end of the book of Acts is around the death of Paul, which was likely in 67 AD, and the persecution of Nero in Rome. Paul and Peter probably both die around 67. But basically, the book of Acts takes us from the death and resurrection of Jesus, probably around 30 AD, maybe a little bit later, 32, 33, to 67. So it covers a period of about 40 years. But even if his first missionary journey is a little bit shorter, one of the things that I think is worth considering is how you get ready for a journey like this. I wonder if he even knew where he was going. You know, lots of you have various vacations planned in the summer. How many of you are planning to be gone for 18 months? Or another way to ask it is, can you pack for 18 months? Not really, right? And we have modern means of transportation. We have the ability to clean our clothes much easier than they did. But it's still quite a journey. And I think that speaks to a lot of Paul, is he's beginning this journey, and I don't think he has all of the money he needs to pay for his way the entire way. He doesn't know what's going to happen. I don't usually plan on journeys where I'm going to go and get arrested and thrown in prison and stoned and dragged out of a city. Not sure about you guys, but that's not usually in my plans. Like, oh yes, I'm going to go get stoned tomorrow. So I think it's worth considering, because one of the other things that happens when you're on a journey is you kind of learn what real Christianity is. Like, everyone can be happy and friendly when you're at church. And the proof is in the pudding when you're waiting in an airport and your flight got canceled and your bags got shipped across the world and the food stand was closed and there's one gate agent for like 6,000 screaming passengers. If you want to know if you're a Christian, think about what you do then, and it'll tell you. But it's got to be a little bit like the missionary journey of St. Paul. He's out with Barnabas and Mark at first, and they're getting stoned and shipwrecked and on and on and on and on. And it's not an easy journey. Is it the kind of journey that you would be tempted to say, you know what? I think I'm going to buy a ticket home. Would any of you be that way? I mean, sometimes I wonder if Paul, who's a little bit headstrong and probably a little bit bold, ends up getting himself into trouble. You know, like, why can't you just stop talking? Why do you have to antagonize them? You know, I could see myself asking questions like that. And so it begins with this separation of Paul and Barnabas, because Barnabas will go with Mark and Paul will go with Silas and eventually recruit Timothy. But I think that you have to remember that this is quite a journey. This is quite a trip. It's not something that's easy. They're not just on a walk in the park. Be more like a walk in the park on days like this when it's 95 outside and there's no wind and who knows what else. So to me, it makes a little bit more sense why Mark may have left. But there's other reasons too. I mean, there's any number of things, and we don't know. It doesn't tell us. It could be that he found out that someone in his family was sick and he needed to travel back. It could be that he wanted to go back for the grape harvest. It could be that, you know, I mean, there's any number of things. It doesn't say why. And that's important because we can easily assume the worst, like, oh, he left because he didn't like the mission. or he wasn't interested in following along, or it got too hard. And it could be those things equally as well. But it could be something very innocent.
Is this Mark the same one that wrote the gospel? No.
Yes.
It is. Oh.
Yes. This is John Mark, who eventually seems to connect with Peter in Rome, and then he writes his gospel from Peter's preaching. At least we think it's the same one. Again, it's sort of like, some of these names got used a lot, and so the church wasn't all that big. One would suppose that a famous person like John Mark, who ends up in Rome, that they wouldn't get confused. But if you don't understand the confusion, sometime try figuring out how many Marys there are in the gospel. And which one is which. And who is the Mary that they're talking about at various points. Like Mary, the sister of Martha.
That's me.
That's you. You were there?
She's amazing.
You're kind of old.
I'd say you look like
Yeah. For being over like 2,000 years old, you're doing pretty well. You'll have to tell us about this Paul and Barnabas characters. But it's hard. So I think it is the same Mark, but it might not be. Paul wants to return to the churches that they founded. This is important for evangelization, that it's not just about proclaiming the gospel. People think about that, the street preachers, the people that go, and they want people to accept Jesus as their Lord and Savior, and that's a good thing. We arguably need more of that. But equally important is actually following through, not just to proclaim it once, but Christianity takes a lot of work. It has to sink in, and it takes a long time. So Paul wants to return to these churches that they founded, and Barnabas wants Mark to come along. We don't know why. It could be because they were cousins. It could be because Barnabas liked Mark. It could be for any number of reasons, but Paul objects to it, saying we should not take with us someone who abandoned the mission. And it's hard to know that this disagreement seems like it ended up blowing up into quite a storm. It's somewhat easy to imagine that happening to St. Paul if he's a bit fiery. So it ends up that Paul and Barnabas separate, and Barnabas and Mark go where? They go to Cyprus, and that's likely because Barnabas is from Cyprus. It was also a place where they had managed to bring, or the Roman governor of the island, Sergius Paulus, who was in Paphos on the west side of Cyprus, that he had come to faith. And so it's very possible that they would be better received there. But it's also part of the mission that these were some of the churches that they did found, and Paul isn't going there. And so one of the other ways to look at this separation is almost in the providence of God, that there's a separation and they actually get more done because they go from one team to two, and they bring some other people into the orbit. Paul goes with Silas to Syria and Cilicia. Cilicia is the region that Tarsus is in. That's where Paul is from. So Cilicia is this region on the south coast of Turkey, just north of Antioch. So in a way, it's like they're both going home. Paul goes to his home in Tarsus, and Barnabas and Mark go to their home on Cyprus. So he goes back to Derbe and Lystra, And this is where I added a little bit. Lystra is a city where he was welcomed as a god. They heal the crippled man by the gates of the city, and the priest of Zeus comes out and wants to offer sacrifice to them, and Paul and Barnabas tear their clothes. And it talks about crying out in Lycaonian. We talked about that there may have been a language issue and a translation issue. So this is also the city that Paul had been stoned there. Like, you could say that this first missionary journey is a series of disasters, because when they get to Turkey, they go to Pisidian Antioch, and they're chased away by the Jewish people there who become jealous of the number of people that are coming to listen to Paul and not listening to them. And then they go to Iconium, and there they attempt to stone Paul, and he runs away at night. So he's probably kind of afraid. And then they go to Lystra, and they cure this man, or God does through them, and then they want to offer sacrifice to them as gods. But by the end of the story in Lystra, Paul is actually stoned and thought is dead and dragged out of the city. That's pretty dead to be dragged. And then Derbe is the only city that it says they made a lot of converts in. And then they go back. And then they sail back to Antioch. So now this time, when he's on his journey, they're going to go back to some of these cities. But I would think that you'd approach somewhere like Lystra with a bit of apprehension if you were stoned there. And then it notes that Timothy is a part of this community, and it talks about Timothy. Timothy is the son of a Jewish, maybe Jewish Christian mother and a Greek father, so Greek pagan father. And Paul, interestingly enough, is preaching primarily where? What is the place that he preaches in? In the synagogue. He goes there almost every week, and in synagogues you would expect to find mostly Jews, Jewish people, Jewish faith, Jewish religion. And so Timothy, you run into this thing. Paul ends up having Timothy circumcised. And it sounds like something that is contrary to the decision that they just made a chapter ago in chapter 15. That the Gentiles were not to be urged to follow Jewish law. In this case, Paul has him circumcised, it says, and I think this is worth thinking about. First of all, that Paul is continuing to seek the Jewish people out. He doesn't reject them. In fact, it probably breaks his heart. He goes to the synagogue consistently, and he's thrown out, and he's beaten, and he's stoned, and he goes back week after week after week. He has a heart for his people. He sees them as part of the plan of God, as part of his ministry. But he also embraces the Gentiles. So that's part of it. The narrative doesn't speak about Timothy's experience at all. And I think that's kind of tragic. I wish it would have said something. Because Timothy must be a grown man by this point. Circumcision is a rather painful operation. If it's not done, I think even when it's done on children, it's painful. But he ends up being circumcised because Paul doesn't want to pose a stumbling block for the Jews of the region. I would say that this is also a sign that Timothy is offering himself for the mission. Like, Christianity is uncomfortable. And if you don't believe that, we're doing it wrong. You know, it's not something just to stay in a comfort zone. And sometimes it's in places that you don't want to go. Sometimes it's in people you don't want to deal with. Sometimes it's in situations. I mean, when you think about the poor, for instance, sometimes I have to scratch my head a little bit when I see the people coming to ask for assistance from the St. Vincent de Paul Society, and you wonder what kind of life choices they're making, and how this is all going to go, because there's a lot to be concerned about. But the poor weren't all that different in the time of Jesus. And it's hard because he has this extreme fondness for the poor, and he talks about the poor, and you think about this again and again, and Jesus talks about reaching out to them. And he doesn't talk about whether they were any more able to receive it. Now, some of it is different because in the ancient world, there were more people who were poor, on the poorer end of the spectrum, just because they didn't have enough to provide. In the modern world, poverty, especially in our area and in much of the United States, is very linked to either the choices that you've made or, in a lot of cases, to mental illness and mental struggles. And we're really, sadly, reaping the fruit that was sown when they closed all of the mental institutions, because now those people are out on the street. It doesn't mean the mental institutions were good in every case. There were serious issues in some of them that needed to be cleaned up. But babies in bathwater are important, and you want to throw out the bathwater and save the baby. But I don't think it's all that different in the ancient world. That there is still this desire to encounter God in the poor. Certainly it wasn't easy to minister to people who were lepers. And there's the powerful story of St. Francis, who struggled so often with leprosy and the smell and just feeling very put off by it, until the day where he finally kisses a leper's hand, I think it is. And there's something profoundly beautiful about that. And so Christianity is kind of like this. You see it in the life of Paul, that there's a beauty to his ministry, and there's a grace, and God moves with power, and there's miracles. But it's also him being beaten and stoned and thrown over walls and escaping in the middle of the night and shipwrecked, and that there's kind of both. There's what is that movie called? I don't remember. There's like the time of shadows and there's a time of glory. And Christianity has both. And sometimes we encounter difficulties in various directions, in one direction or another, and we have to be ready for that. We should be suspicious of it. Jesus talks about all of the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor. And the last one is, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness. That Jesus fully expects there to be persecutions. Sometimes that might be your own fault, and sometimes might have nothing to do with you. But our faith invites us to that, and invites us to live through that in a way of trusting God. I think Timothy is a great example of this. I mean, Timothy could have said heck no and thrown up his hands and gone another direction. Like, he could have protested to Paul, your own decision in the Council of Jerusalem. You were there. You heard them say that this should not be imposed on the Gentiles. And Timothy is evidently a Gentile. He comes from at least a Gentile family, a Gentile father. And he could have argued no, but he sees his role and the proclamation of the gospel as being more important. So it notes that they travel around to many towns and they preach. They share the decision of the council in Jerusalem. But I think this is a difficulty. I don't really understand why Paul does this, because to me it does seem contrary to the decision of the council in Jerusalem. It doesn't quite fit and it doesn't make sense. But again, just because I've gone through seminary, I don't get to sort through all the mysteries of the scriptures easily. Paul brings along Timothy, and he notes that, like Timothy and Titus and people like Silas, he is training them to be leaders of local churches. Timothy becomes a bishop of Ephesus. Titus, I think, is sent to Crete, and several of his other companions become bishops in other cities. And this is part of what we talk about with the importance of discipleship, of walking along and accompanying people. It's the same thing that Jesus did. Jesus lived with 12 guys and sent them out. Paul is living with several others, and he's training them for the mission. My guess is by the end of the time that Paul is with Timothy and he sends him off to Ephesus to be a bishop, Timothy doesn't really feel ready, but it's kind of the way it goes. It's not because you feel ready that God calls you or puts you in the right place. It's because he needs you. And he wants you, and God doesn't seem to care very much whether you're good at this or not. If you think so, think of Peter. Peter in the Gospels is not a good fisherman. He hardly ever catches anything except for when Jesus tells him to. He's not a man of theological training, and Jesus picks him to be an apostle. And here's another great piece. So Paul is on this journey. They go to Derbe and Iconium and Lystra and Pisidian Antioch. And then he wants to go to Asia, which is the western end of Turkey, probably to Ephesus. Ephesus would be the major city in Asia. Pergamum, Sardis, those are all in the province of Asia. But he talks about being prevented. And then he wants to go, so they end up going to Phrygia and Galatia. I don't even know if it has Phrygia on our map. I wonder where that is. You'll have to look it up. So he goes there, and he seems to be establishing new churches along the way. And then he wants to go to Bithynia and Pontus, which is on the northern end, the south shore of the Black Sea. But again, he can't go there. He talks about being prevented by the Holy Spirit. So he goes to Troas. Troas is on the Straits of, I think they're called the Dardanelles. You can see them in modern Turkey today. So there's a long strait, and he ends up sailing from Troas to Macedonia. Macedonia is across the sea in northern Greece, where Philip was from. Philip, the father of Alexander the Great. Philip of Macedon. He was Macedonian. That's where the name Philippi comes from, the city. And Paul has this vision of a Macedonian who comes and stands before him and invites him to come over and help them. This is the first time a missionary enters Europe. This is a profound moment because Christianity will shape European history like no other place on earth. Sometimes for better and sometimes for worse, or at least people used it badly. But he goes to Macedonia. It's in the northern end of Greece. Like I said, the map, if you look in the book, you can find a better map, I think. Or if you look online, Paul's second missionary journey, you can find better maps. This one's a little bit harder to read now that it's been copied so many times. But I think this is a good example for us because Paul was probably frustrated. He wanted to go two different places. He was probably sure that God was calling him there, and he doesn't get to either one. But he gets sent to somewhere he didn't want to go, all the way across the sea to Greece. And he keeps getting shipwrecked, so my suspicion is he might not want to get on boats. I mean, who knows? That might have been the disagreement between Paul and Barnabas and Mark. Mark is like, let's take a boat. And Paul is like, last time we were on a boat, it didn't go so well. The will of God is sometimes quite humorous because the old saying goes, the best laid plans of mice and men. God has his own desires and he arranges things. He's working in providence, and it ends up being very providential that Paul goes there. We have to deal with frustration and anger. We can't bottle it up forever. You have to find a way to process and work through your emotions. Some of that is bringing it to the Lord, bringing your feelings into the open, sharing with Jesus, this is where I'm at. Just because it's Paul doesn't mean everything goes well. It's like our travel difficulties today, except probably worse because they get stranded for days. I mean, there were entire seasons where they didn't really sail across the Mediterranean. Any guess why? The weather. It was either rough seas or the wind was blowing in the wrong direction. And when you have a sailboat, it's real important that you have the wind blowing in the right direction, because if it doesn't, your sails don't work. In fact, they work against you. So they're traveling to Europe, and they go from Troas to Samothrace. Samothrace is a small island between Asia, the province of Asia, and northern Greece. There's a famous sculpture from Samothrace called the Winged Victory. It's in the Louvre. If you've been to the Louvre, you probably walked under it. It's this giant statue. It's missing a head, but it's quite famous. This is the island that it's from. And oddly enough, Paul, it says, only spends a day there. Like, so much for preaching to them. You know, if you're from Samothrace, you're just out of luck. Like, yep, no gospel for you. Why do you think Paul does that? Someone, be brave. Guess.
Somebody's already gone there?
Somebody's already gone there. That could be. There could be an already established Christian church. Anyone else? How large is the island? That's a great question. I don't know. I don't know what was on Samothrace at this time. That'd be another good thing to look up. Paul's destination is Philippi, and Philippi was the leading city of the region. So my suspicion is that Paul actually wants to establish a church in the leading city of the region and build it up there, because then they could send missionaries to these other places while he moves on. It seems like he wants to establish a base of operations in Philippi, but it could be some other reason. I mean, that's not a bad one, or that there weren't enough people there. It could be that they're in a hurry or their boat didn't stay, but it is kind of odd that Paul, who is so interested in proclaiming the gospel in every place that he goes, you know, if you're from Samothrace, you're just out of luck. Like, oops, you were born wrong. No gospel for you. But Philippi was a capital of the region. It was the Roman capital. It was a city that was primarily formed of Roman soldiers. Former Roman soldiers. It could have been Latin speaking, and it was a center of commerce and trade. It's likely a very Roman town, and we know that because it talks about Paul going to preach on the Sabbath, but in this case he doesn't go to a synagogue. It says he goes to a place of prayer. Probably because there weren't enough Jewish believers to build and support a synagogue. So he goes to this place of prayer, places where often Gentiles would gather, and he preaches. He meets some women there. The women, again, are the banner carriers of religion, even in the ancient world. And he meets a dealer in purple cloth named Lydia. Now, a dealer in purple cloth, why is that important?
It cost so much to make it that color.
Purple was the most expensive color. And there's a few variations of it. So the old color royal blue you've heard of is the same kind of thing. Royal blue